Hi, Jen again. We're back with another reading of Follower, How Getting Close to Jesus Brings You to Yourself, written by me. We are going to skip chapter 2 because that whole chapter is essentially a spiritual practice all by itself, and it's not as good as a read aloud as it is to just kind of do yourself. So you'll have to get the book to do chapter 2. We are going to read chapter 3, entitled If It's You. Matthew 14, 13 through 33. I'm pretty sure I was less distractible before social media than I am now. With so many avenues for input, I have a really hard time focusing these days. But focus matters. It gives us direction. What we focus on reveals where we're placing our faith, our trust, our reliance. And where we place our faith affects who we become, our identity. Putting focus and faith in ourselves alone is a dead end, since our identity is formed by who or what we trust. If we trust in ourselves before we know ourselves, we become a closed loop and don't mature very well. Despite how such vulnerability leaves us open to the potential for harmful input, we do need other people to help us figure out who we are. If we focus on and learn to trust someone or something outside ourselves, provided that person's identity is healthily developed and secure, our own identity will develop much more readily. Then we will become people of substance who are reliable and worth trusting. Let's see what happens to Simon and to us as we focus on the next part of his story. When Jesus heard what had happened, Matthew says, Matthew 14:13, which might, if you are a vigilant and curious reader, make you ask, okay, what had happened? We know that the Gospels often tell the same stories with different details from each other. We also know that one of the details they occasionally change is the order in which they tell the stories. Lots of times, the actual order of events, which we, in our time and culture, tend to think is very important, was less significant to these writers than the themes they were trying to emphasize. For example, it's mostly unclear whether the last chapter's story about the 72 happened before or after today's story. Because of the fact that none of the gospel writers make it a point to always tell every single story in chronological order, when the gospels do match the order of events in their telling, there's something significant for us to consider in the chronological order itself. All four gospel writers match the order of at least two events leading up to today's story. The matching what had happened that Jesus hears about is that his cousin, John the Baptizer, whom we met in chapter 1, has been executed. The baptizer had described Jesus as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, John 1:29. He had described himself with a verse from the Old Testament prophet Isaiah, the voice of one calling in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord, John 1:23. Making straight the way for the Lord got him into some hot water with a local pseudo-king, Herod, and he ended up in prison. While John was in prison, Jesus sent his 12 disciples, at least 2 of whom, as we have seen, used to be the baptizer's disciples, also to prepare the way of the Lord in the towns Jesus hadn't visited yet. As we saw in the last chapter, which I'm not reading for this video series, they were to go and teach people about the kingdom of God and heal the sick, just as Jesus was doing, getting people ready for Jesus to come visit them himself. When we pick up the story here in Matthew 14, the 12 have just come back from their mission trip, and Jesus is getting the news that his faithful cousin has been unjustly beheaded. So Matthew tells us, when Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place, Matthew 14:13. Here's why it's a good idea to read the same story in all 4 Gospels if you can. Mark, Luke, and John also mention the death of John the Baptist, but they focus more on the disciples' return from their trip. When we read this story in those Gospels, the emphasis can make us think, oh, how nice of Jesus, who had obviously just been sitting around doing nothing while the 12 are gone, to try to take his faithful disciples on a little debriefing retreat. If we're familiar with the story, we know he doesn't succeed, but there's a crowd of people coming right up. But it's a thoughtful impulse, right? Matthew, on the other hand, focuses on Jesus. When Jesus heard what had happened, that his cousin, the one biological family member that we know of who truly believed in him at this point, had been executed, he got in a boat with the other people who had just been preparing the way of the Lord. Matthew doesn't mention the 12 in the boat, although we can be sure they were there. It was probably Simon Peter's boat, in fact, and Jesus wasn't part of the crew. What if the real reason, or at least a big reason, Jesus wanted to take the boat and his disciples to a quiet place was that he was grieving? What if it was that he knew he was ultimately going to face something even worse than his cousin had? And so maybe he wanted a chance to connect with his father and with this band of brothers he was building for himself. They hadn't been with him when he got the news because they were off doing the work he had given them. What if he, as much as or even more than the 12, was the one who needed the support and debriefing right then? Jesus is God, and he is also human. When we are at our lowest, we humans need God, and we need each other. The 12 get back from their first trip exhilarated, and there's Jesus waiting for them. But his face is drawn, his eyes are tired, and he says, "Hey guys, let's take the boat and go to that place. You know the one." Maybe it was a place they had retreated to before, where Jesus had taught them and they had learned what they needed to know for their trip. It's clear that the intention now for this boat trip is for everybody to get a little R&R. Matthew says he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. And later in verse 15, the disciples say, this is a remote place. In other words, this place is in the middle of nowhere. You get the idea that nobody else is supposed to know about it. So you can almost feel the exhausted, disappointed, but maybe slightly hilarious surprise that Matthew shows but doesn't tell us. Jesus withdrew privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the town. Just think about this for a second. The 12 went off to prepare the way for Jesus. Suddenly, there are a whole lot more people than before who know about Jesus. And we don't get the impression anywhere that every or any of these disciples was a strategist or had high emotional intelligence or even was the sharpest tack in the box. So perhaps somebody on their kingdom declaring trip spilled the beans about this location. Maybe more than one of them did. Maybe it was Peter. There would have been no ill intent. They were all excited about Jesus and what he was asking them to do. They wanted other people to get to know him too. And they had been tasked with preparing the way, so they did. Possibly all the way to the remote, solitary place. Maybe that's why Jesus doesn't turn the boat around. For various reasons, every person on it, including Jesus, is exhausted. But Matthew tells us, when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Matthew 14:14. Then he feeds them all-you-can-eat fish and chips from almost nothing. He knows these people are the reason he came to that time and place. Even though they don't really understand who he is, there's something about him that they know they need. They seek him out, and he lets them find him. In the book of the Hebrew prophet Jeremiah, God tells God's people, "You will seek me, and you will find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord." Jeremiah 29:13-14. We won't spend a lot of time here focusing on the eating part of this story, except to point out that in this instance, Jesus does fulfill a hint of Jeremiah's promise, and he does it when, humanly speaking, he's running on empty. We don't often think of the story this way, We know the disciples have already spent a significant time traveling and healing people, and so they're tired, but we can kind of imagine them pushing through just a bit longer because now Jesus is here and they can default to him. And Jesus is here and they can rely on him. They do that and miracles happen. But Jesus is sad and also tired. Most of us get tired when we're sad too. Keeping all that in mind will help us have a clearer imagination for the rest of the story, which is where we are about to focus. Specifically, we're focusing on that part after Jesus says to the 12, okay guys, take the boat and get out of here. I'll catch up with you later. And after he gets the crowds to leave too. Matthew says he dismissed them. John says he hid from them. We can guess it was a bit of both. It's two different ways of expressing the idea that finally Jesus gets his alone time in this solitary, middle of nowhere place with his Father. We can tell how restorative this time is for Jesus because afterward, he walks on the water to his friends. People have proposed varying theories about the significance of Jesus' walking on water. Some people talk about Mark, who most likely got the bulk of information for his gospel from Peter, highlighting connections to the Exodus story. Others suggest that this episode is about Jesus' displaying his authority over the supernatural powers that oppose God, which are often represented by storms and seas. I see the dynamic of Jesus displaying his authority over the supernatural powers more evidently in the story where Jesus calms a truly life-threatening storm on the Sea of Galilee. You can read about that in Matthew 8:23-27, Mark 4:35-41, and Luke 8:22-25. In our present story, the wind is kicked up and the waves are choppy, but it doesn't seem like anyone is in fear of their lives. I wonder if sometimes, certainly not always, the deeper underlying symbolism of Jesus' action at any given time had more to do with who he is by nature and less the point he was consciously trying to make in the moment. I propose that consciously, walking on water is Jesus' way of letting his hair down. Otherwise, what is the point of this miracle? On a ministry, spiritual, or even logistical level, there is no real purpose to what happens here. Jesus doesn't have to walk on the water to get to his disciples. He could walk on the land and meet them in the morning, or he could stay where he is and have the disciples pick him up later. He's not trying to prove anything to the crowds. They're gone for the night. Picture Jesus, alone with his Father, being comforted and strengthened, staring across the wave-tossed Sea of Galilee, feeling the wind that's tossing the waves which are spraying his face, blowing through his hair. He takes a deep breath of it. Coincidentally, or not, the Hebrew word for wind and breath is the same word used for spirit. We could say that nobody's around except Jesus, his Father, and his Spirit. And those 12 friends of his who are way out there in their little boat wrestling with the same wind as they try to get to the other side of the lake. After an exhausting day of compassion and giving, after the news of the unjust execution of his cousin, Jesus is free to be totally himself. He smiles. He takes a step onto the water and begins to walk. Jesus is having fun. Sometimes people try to tell me Jesus was a big show-off and the only reason he did miracles was to get famous. But that doesn't add up. Healing people, if you can heal people, is not showing off. It's doing good. If you can do it, you should do it. Whether you are a doctor, trained and operating according to natural laws, or whether you have a supernatural ability from God. Jesus did not do flashy, show-off miracles. He healed people. This walking on water miracle, on the other hand, would be a flashy show-off miracle, except no one else witnesses it except the 12. And here's how we know Jesus was not in the habit of doing things like this to show off. His disciples don't recognize him. They see him coming across the water. He's too far away for them to see his features, and they don't say, "Oh, hey, look, it's Jesus. He's always doing stuff like this." No. Like me, and I assume you, they've never seen a human being walk on water before. They think he's a ghost, and they absolutely flip out. Matthew says they cried out in fear, Matthew 14:26, but I think that's probably an understatement because remember, Jesus is not close enough for them to recognize him, and it's super windy out there, so it must be noisy, but Jesus still hears them. And then, maybe partly because he's experienced in preaching across the water from boats, he's able to call back loudly enough for them to hear him. Chill, guys, it's me. Don't freak out. And now, finally, we get to Peter. 2 chapters ago, we saw a responsible working man named Simon begin to be transformed into the enthusiastic, impulsive, Jesus-devoted Peter that we know and love. I'm convinced this is the story where those true colors really begin to shine through, where we see Peter being transformed by Jesus into who he truly is. Lord, if it's you, he calls out to Jesus, tell me to come to you on the water. Matthew 14:28. Before the giant catch of fish that we talked about, I doubt that guy Simon would have ever thought of suggesting he get out of his own boat, or anyone else's for that matter, when it was in the middle of a lake. To clarify, the so-called Sea of Galilee is really a large lake, also known as Kinneret. He would have known that the world just plain doesn't work like that. But after the catch of fish, another potentially showy miracle which only Simon and probably 3 other fishermen saw, his expectations of how the world works, at least around Jesus, have been overturned. And since then, this man, Peter, has been spending time with Jesus and becoming more like Jesus, to the point of having just gotten back from a trip where he was teaching and healing and even casting out demons like Jesus. 2 things seem to be going on in Peter's somewhat impulsive shout. The first is that he has discovered beyond the shadow of a doubt that wherever Jesus is, he wants to be. And, except for this long, exhausting day they've all been through where none of them really have had a chance to reconnect with each other, and which has metaphorically felt a little like trying to row this boat back across the lake into the headwind, he hasn't had much opportunity to be with Jesus lately. So, if it's really Jesus, he doesn't want to waste any more time apart from this man who has redefined his life and his world. Also, and I suspect this was more intuitive than reasoned out, he's come back from doing all these amazing things that are just like what Jesus does, healing sick people and casting out demons mainly. Now, here's Jesus walking on water. So, if it's really you, Jesus, and I can now do the things you can do, I can walk on water too. If it's not really Jesus, and Peter steps out of the boat, he's still close enough to the boat, and don't forget, he's familiar with water, he can swim, that the other disciples can haul him back in. But if it is Jesus, then because it's Jesus, Peter will be able to do this, and he doesn't want to miss another minute away from him. This is great faith and great love. Sometimes people, I admit to having once been one of those people, like to make fun of Peter for being a little bit headlong and stupid. But what he does here is about his relationship with his Lord. He loves Jesus. The world will tell us that's stupid, certainly. The Bible calls it the foolishness of God, 1 Corinthians 1:25, which is the Bible's way of saying it's really the smartest thing we could ever do with our lives. Maybe, really, Peter was the smartest disciple. Anyway, Jesus sees Peter's desire and loves it, and loves Peter, and invites Peter to join him, just as Peter asked. It is really him, after all. Jesus is not the one who says, hold up, you might want to think about this first. It is really me, but why don't you just sit tight and I'll finish my walk to you. Leave this to the professional. Don't try this at home or in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. On the contrary, Jesus is restored and refreshed. Jesus is being fully himself with his Father and his 12 buddies, and he's having fun. This wind is nothing to him. Or it's the Spirit, which is even better. So, Peter wants to join in on the fun? Absolutely. Come on then, Jesus says. Peter gets out of the boat, and he doesn't sink, but at this point he must not even be thinking about that because he's just focused on getting to Jesus, and not on precisely how he's getting to him. My husband and I rehashed this story together the first time I taught it, and it was he who pointed out to me that Jesus must have still been a good distance away from the boat, since even though they could hear him, the disciples, including Peter, couldn't recognize him by sight. But also, my husband reasoned, this must have been true because when Peter starts to sink, the boat and the disciples aren't, after all, right there to haul him in. Peter is focused on the figure standing on the waves, and Peter is walking. And he's walking, and he's walking, and he's walking, and he gets a decent way out, and he's almost to Jesus, and it really is Jesus, which he already knew because he made it out there, but now he can see Jesus' face, and he smiles, and he looks around. Yeah, I did it! Only now he's not looking at Jesus anymore. Maybe he's instinctively taking credit for having gotten out there, forgetting that it's only because of Jesus he's able to do such a thing, just like it was only because of Jesus that they were able to feed at least 10,000 people earlier that day. But whether he's taking personal credit or not, Peter is now focused on his surroundings, not Jesus. He's in the middle of a large body of water. It's a familiar body of water, but usually there's a boat between him and it. And the water is not, shall we say, like glass. It's windy out there. Also, by the way, people can't walk on water, which he maybe should have thought of before because that giant wave just smacked him in the face and help! He's sinking. The boat is way back there, but Jesus is in front of him. As soon as Peter cries out, Jesus reaches out his hands and hauls Peter up. He doesn't wait. He doesn't choose to let Peter flounder a bit. Jesus wants his followers to imitate him. But maintaining that imitation takes focused faith in the one we're imitating. This is why I don't think anymore, even though I used to, that when Jesus says, "You have little faith, why did you doubt?" Matthew 14:31. He says it in a stern, scolding tone. Maybe he was even grinning. You asked if it was me, and it was, and you got all the way out here focused on me. Why'd you stop? All the way back to the boat, Peter has his hand in Jesus's, like Peter's a little kid, which, as a follower of Jesus, he kind of is. They make their way back to the others through the wind and the waves, which don't die down until after they get into the boat, at which point none of the other guys can do much else but worship Jesus. And that is the story of how the shenanigans of two friends almost ended, but didn't, in disaster. Which is, I guess, the way we could look at it if we weren't focusing on Jesus. But it's really the story of focus and faith and identity. Simon began to transform into Peter the moment more fish than he had ever caught in his life landed in his boat. At first, he thought the correct response to this Jesus, for whom the world worked differently than for anyone else, was to send him away. But Jesus showed Peter that really, the solution for his earthbound thoughts and behaviors was for Peter to spend more time with him, not less. Peter took this seriously enough to keep navigating the boat to shore even when they could clearly see that instead of a solitary place, they were about to encounter all at once the crowds of people the 12 of them had been reaching out to for weeks before. He got through that day because his focus was on Jesus. Peter takes spending time with Jesus seriously enough that when Jesus is just kind of messing around with the laws of physics for fun, Peter wants to be with him for that too. Work and play. Everything in Peter's life is becoming focused on Jesus, and Peter's whole identity is changing because of it. He used to be a fisherman. Now he's fishing for people. Now he's supernaturally healing people and casting out demons. Now he's helping feed a crowd of far more people than even that giant catch of fish would have provided for, with a couple of pieces of bread and some sardines. Now he's walking on water. This is not who Simon was, but it is who Peter is becoming. He is becoming like the one he is focused on, in whom he has put his faith. When Jesus caught Peter up out of the waves, he asked Peter why he doubted. I'm starting to think that doubt is not really so much disbelief as it is a shift of focus and a shift of faith. While Peter was walking out to Jesus, he was focused on Jesus, as he had been all day. But once he got there, he was distracted by what was around him. We all do this, don't we? Sometimes we say, if only God would show up right in front of me, I would do this or believe this or whatever. And then we're distracted by shiny things or squirrels or social media. God couldn't have been more right in front of Peter than he was at that moment. And Peter loved Jesus and was being transformed into Jesus' likeness, and he still got distracted. We don't have to beat ourselves up when we get distracted. Jesus doesn't. He refocuses us. He reminds us to trust him. He keeps on crafting our souls so that we reflect him, the glory of God. In other words, when we get tired, when we get distracted, when we get scared, Jesus doesn't usually take us out of our circumstances. He just grabs us by the hand and says, "Come on, you know me. Trust me." It always helps, though, when we have a clearer idea of who he is. We and Peter are about to get one. See you tomorrow.